Assalamu alaikum everyone, brother Dawah here. So in today's video we will be talking about the moral argument. I'll be trying to explain it in depth and start off by giving a brief historical view on it. So let's begin. The moral arguments are basically the argument for God's existence. They fall under a diverse family of arguments that reason for a feature of morality or of the moral life to the existence of God. What the argument tries to do is show that if you believe that morality is in some way objective or real, and that this moral reality requires explanation, then there needs to be a being like God that provides the explanation of objective morality, or otherwise it will be subjective and basically be people's opinion, and morality will just be opinions at that point. Moral arguments try to deal with very important philosophical ideas in meta-ethics. So now let's look into the history of the moral arguments. One of the most ancient writings that we can find on something that seems like an argument regarding morality and God is a Euthyphro's dilemma. We can find it in Plato's writings, in which Socrates asks Euthyphro, "Is the pious loved by the god because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the god?" Socrates is said to have lived around 470 BC and died approximately in 399 BC. So this is from that period. And from here, let's just forward to something that resembles more to the moral argument for God's existence is going to be the argument from value by Thomas Aquinas in his book The Five Ways. He lived around 1225 to 1274, I believe. So him making the argument from value is from that time period, and it is more or less arguing for values rather than the moral argument that we know of today. Thomas believed that the standards of good, true, noble are not just merely ideal or hypothetical, and are actually real. Hence, there needs to be a being that has the quality to be a maximum of these qualities, such as ideally good, true, or noble, for any other being to possess some of these qualities to some extent. And then let's forward a few more centuries to about 1788 at the time of Immanuel Kant. So he is a very famous Christian philosopher. He has more famously argued in the sense of the moral arguments that we see today, and the formulation of today's moral argument can be seen as a reflection of Immanuel Kant's type of arguments. So Immanuel Kant actually didn't believe that you can rationally or using arguments prove God. Only you can rationally argue for the belief in God as a postulate of practical reasons. Kant held this that a rational moral being must necessarily will the highest good. So if the moral being necessarily wills the highest good, then his goal must be to achieve happiness. Okay, it must be both morally good and happiness. So the condition is happiness of all the moral virtues and all the moral actions. And then he further on believed that a person cannot rationally will such an end without believing that moral actions can successfully achieve such an end. So this kind of requires a causal chain of belief for a primary good being in nature, and that being shows God. And then from here we just got multiple arguments, such as W.R. Sorley argument in the 1980s, then Hastings Rashdoll argument in the 1920s, then Taylor's argument in the 1945, and many arguments. But in this video I'll be discussing William Lane Craig's formulation of the moral argument, because I do believe that he makes valid points, and I'll be trying to add a few more to them to support the premises, and reach the conclusion, and hopefully you guys will be able to understand it even better. Okay, so the moral argument goes something like this in general. The first premise is there are objective moral facts. The second premise is without God there are no objective moral facts, or something. Sometimes it says God can be the only explanation of the objective moral facts. The third conclusion will be therefore God exists. And yes, I agree. The second premise can and is formulated by different philosophers in different ways. For example, they say God provides the best explanation of the existence of objective moral facts, therefore God exists, or therefore God probably exists. Yes, but the argument is still sound and valid, because if the first two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows, as it is a deductive argument. Okay, so let's deal with the moral argument, and the first premise is that moral, objective moral views or moral facts exist. What do we mean by moral? When we say objective moral views, we mean something that is truly wrong or truly right. Something like, let me just think of something. For example, killing innocent people is objectively bad. If I say that, it means that it is a fact that it is bad, it is wrong. It is not relative, it is not subjective. If someone thinks that it is okay to kill an innocent person, then he's just wrong, and if he does it, he'll be morally wrong. And if I say that in any situation, it cannot be right either, because killing innocent people is objectively wrong. Now let's move on to the second premise. Is God the best explanation, or is it only possible for objective moral values to exist? If God exists, I would say yes, because for something to be objectively moral, it should not be able to be any other way possible. If something is objectively right or wrong, then in any situation it could not have been any other way. It could not have been right if it is wrong. Then people go ahead and ask, why do you need God to say something is objectively wrong or right? Well, you see, for us to say something is objectively right or wrong, the source or from where we get the knowledge of that objectively right or wrong needs to be, for example, all knowing, all just, all wise. He needs to have certain criteria or attributes. So God needs to be all knowing, or uh, there could be a possibility if God is not all knowing, then there could be a case where what He told us is wrong or right, could be the opposite way. If God was not all just, then He could have been unjust to us and told us something that was wrong is right. And if God was not all wise, then He could have just been wrong in delivering or understanding or concluding his message to us. If God was not all powerful, then there could be an issue while the transmission of these objective moral values, and many other factors could play in to his attributes. But a being like this needs to exist for things like objective moral values or objective knowledge. Otherwise, things can be subjective. So, from this, it concludes that the first premise is true and the second premise is true, then God exists. Now, let's go ahead and deal with some counter arguments that a lot of atheists or people who don't believe in objective morality bring. They say something like, well, I am an atheist and I still do things that are objectively good, or you believe that are objectively good. Well, you see, I never made the claim with this argument that an atheist or someone who doesn't believe in God cannot be good or cannot do good. I'm saying that if there is no God, then there is no objective good. And then they go ahead and say, well, if something like evolution can give moral standards, well, then I'll just go ahead and say that, well, something that is natural doesn't mean that it is right. If you say that, then it is a fallacy, a naturalistic fallacy. And even if you're not saying that, and you're just saying that evolution explains it, well, if something explains it doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It just shows that morality comes from let's say evolution, and it's a naturalistic process, and it just shows that it is still subjective and not objective. It is not actually wrong or right to do something bad or good. It is only due to evolution. So in reality, it is just as moral for me to cut open a tree or cut open a rock as it is moral to cut open a person. It is just me uh, splitting or distancing the atoms from each other when I'm just cutting it. So it doesn't prove morality. In short, the moral argument for God just says that objective moral values do exist and it can only be explained by God, and hence God exists. And if you go ahead and disagree with this, then you're just saying that moral values are subjective and opinions, and one's opinions cannot be greater than some other's opinion, and this will just become your morality and your basic basis to live. So that's it from me for today. Hope you guys have a good day. Masalama.